The morning sun of June 4th, 1942, cast long shadows across the Pacific as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier strike force approached what they believed would be another easy victory. 400 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, the cream of Japan's naval aviation prepared for what Tokyo had promised would be the decisive blow against American naval power in the Pacific. Nagumo stood on the bridge of the flagship Akagi, his weathered face betraying none of the uncertainty gnawing at his strategic mind. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami, crushing Allied resistance from Hawaii to the Dutch East Indies. Now, Operation MI promised to extend that dominance by seizing Midway and drawing the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a final crushing battle. But 300 miles to the northeast, Admiral Chester Nimitz had already sprung his carefully laid trap. The American commander had done something the Japanese believed impossible. He had broken their most secret naval codes. Every detail of Nagumo's approach, every element of Admiral Yamamoto's grand strategy lay exposed on the codebreakers' desks in Hawaii like pieces of a solved puzzle. Captain Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts had worked tirelessly through May, piecing together intercepts that revealed not just the target, Midway, but the exact timing and disposition of Japanese forces. According to contemporary naval intelligence reports, archived at the National Security Agency, this code-breaking achievement represented one of the most significant intelligence coups in military history. When Nimitz received confirmation that AF, the Japanese code name for Midway, was indeed the target, he positioned his forces with surgical precision. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the Pacific War. Nagumo commanded 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, with over 250 aircraft and Japan's most experienced pilots. Supporting them were 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, a force that had dominated every engagement since the war began. Unknown to the Japanese admiral, Admiral Raymond Spruance and Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher waited with 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Though outnumbered in ships and aircraft, the Americans possessed something far more valuable: complete knowledge of enemy intentions and perfect positioning to exploit Japanese tactical weaknesses. As Nagumo's planes lifted off for their first strike against Midway's airfield, neither he nor his pilots realized they were flying into the most carefully orchestrated ambush in naval history. The Japanese battle plan, so meticulously crafted in Tokyo's war rooms, was about to encounter the one element no strategist could account for: an enemy who knew every move before it was made. The trap was closing, and the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance of the next few hours. At 0630 hours on June 4th, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led 108 Japanese aircraft toward Midway Atoll, their engines carving silver contrails across the dawn sky. Below, the tiny coral island bristled with American defenses that Nagumo's intelligence had gravely underestimated. What the Japanese expected to find was a lightly defended fuel depot. What awaited them was a fortress prepared for siege. Major Floyd Parks commanded Midway's air defenses from a reinforced command bunker, watching his radar screens paint an ominous picture of approaching doom. 26 obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters rose to meet the incoming strike, their pilots knowing they flew inferior machines against Japan's finest aviators. What they lacked in equipment, they made up for in desperate courage. The first air battle erupted 20 miles from Midway as Marine Captain Marion Carl and his squadron intercepted Tomonaga's formation. The sky exploded into a deadly ballet of tracers and fire as Mitsubishi Zeros tore through the American formation. Within minutes, 15 Buffalo fighters were spinning toward the ocean in flames, their pilots' sacrifice buying precious time for Midway's ground defenses. Tomonaga's bombers pressed their attack against the island's facilities, their bombs cratering runways and setting fuel dumps ablaze. but the Japanese lieutenant quickly realized that one strike would not be sufficient. Radio messages crackled back to Nagumo's flagship. There is need for a second attack wave. The American defenses had proven far more resilient than intelligence reports suggested. Meanwhile, Midway's surviving aircraft launched their own desperate counterattack. Army Air Force Captain James Collins led 6 Martin Marauder medium bombers in a low-level assault against Nagumo's carriers, their crews knowing they faced almost certain death. The formation flew straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zero fighters, with only 2 bombers surviving the approach. Their torpedoes missed, but the attack achieved something far more valuable. It convinced Nagumo that American air power on Midway remained dangerously intact. The Japanese admiral faced his first critical decision of the battle. His second wave of aircraft sat armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for use against American warships, which his scouts had not yet located. But Tomonaga's urgent message demanded immediate attention. At 07:15, Nagumo issued the order that would prove fatal. Planes in second attack wave stand by to carry out attack today. Re-equip the attack planes with bombs. Contemporary Japanese naval records, as documented in the official war history series published by Japan's defense agency, reveal the confusion and time pressure that influenced this crucial decision. Hundreds of Japanese maintenance crews immediately began the laborious process of switching ordnance on 93 aircraft. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs came down. High-explosive bombs for land targets went up. The work would take at least an hour during which Nagumo's most powerful weapons sat helplessly on his hangar decks. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the architect of Pearl Harbor's success, watched this frenetic activity from Akagi's bridge with growing unease. The morning's events had already deviated from the careful script Tokyo had written. American resistance was stiffer than expected, the island's defenses remained operational, and most troubling of all, no American fleet units had been spotted despite intensive search efforts. As Japanese ordnance crews raced against time in the carrier's hangar decks, they unknowingly prepared the stage for their own destruction. The bombs and torpedoes scattered across the hangar floors would soon become the instruments of their ship's doom. Nagumo's perfect battle plan was beginning to unravel, thread by thread, decision by decision. At 07:28, Scout Plane Number 4 from the heavy cruiser Tone transmitted a message that would change the course of the Pacific War. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The radio crackled with static as Nagumo's staff officers clustered around the communications equipment, their confident expressions suddenly turning grave. Admiral Nagumo felt the first cold touch of uncertainty as he processed this intelligence. His entire operation had been predicated on the assumption that American naval forces were either at Pearl Harbor or scattered across the vast Pacific. The presence of enemy ships this close to Midway suggested something his planners had never considered, that the Americans might be expecting him. Flight Petty Officer Amari aboard the Tone's scout plane strained his eyes through the morning haze, trying to identify the composition of the American force. At 0820, his follow-up report sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier. The hunters had suddenly discovered they were being hunted. Nagumo faced the most agonizing decision of his naval career. His second attack wave was still being rearmed for land targets, a process requiring at least another 30 minutes. His first strike force was returning from Midway, low on fuel and ammunition. Should he launch immediately with whatever aircraft were ready, or wait for his full striking power to be prepared? The wrong choice would mean disaster. 300 miles away, Admiral Raymond Spruance had already made his decision. From the bridge of the Enterprise, he calculated distances, fuel consumption, and attack windows with the precision of a mathematics professor, which he had been before the war. His staff urged caution, suggesting they wait until the range closed further, But Spruance understood something they did not. This was his only chance to catch the Japanese carriers with their aircraft on deck, vulnerable and unable to maneuver freely. At 0702, the Enterprise and Hornet began launching their strike groups into the bright Pacific morning. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, while Lieutenant Commander John Waldron prepared to take 15 Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet in what everyone knew would be a suicide mission. The obsolete Devastators were so slow that Japanese fighters could virtually hover alongside them while delivering killing shots. According to pilot memoirs collected by the Naval History and Heritage Command, many air crews that morning understood they were flying their final mission. Lieutenant George Gay, piloting one of Waldron's torpedo bombers, wrote farewell letters before takeoff, sealing them in his flight suit pocket. The mathematical odds were brutally simple. Slow American torpedo planes against fast Japanese fighters meant certain death for most who participated. As the American strike groups formed up and headed west toward the Japanese fleet, they carried with them the hopes of a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor's devastation. Behind them, the damaged Yorktown launched her own aircraft, despite structural damage that should have kept her in port for months. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's crew had performed miracles of repair work, getting their ship battle-ready in just 72 hours, instead of the 3 months normally required. The stage was now set for the most crucial air-sea battle in Pacific War history. Japanese carriers steamed toward their fate with decks crowded by aircraft, fuel lines, and ammunition, perfect targets for dive bombers. American air crews flew toward almost certain death, their obsolete planes carrying the last hopes of a desperate nation. In the next hour, the course of World War II would be decided by courage, skill, and the cruel mathematics of aerial combat. At 0920, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's voice crackled over the radio frequency. "We'll go in. We won't turn back. Good luck." 15 Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 dropped to wave-top level, beginning their final approach toward Nagumo's carriers. Every pilot knew the odds. None wavered in their duty. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol fell upon Waldron's formation like hunting hawks. 0 fighters, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, dove from altitude, their 20-millimeter cannons ripping through the slow American torpedo bombers with devastating precision. One by one, the Devastators exploded into the ocean or cartwheeled into the waves, trailing fire and smoke across the brilliant blue Pacific. Ensign George Gay watched in horror as his squadron mates died around him. His own aircraft took hit after hit from pursuing Zeros, hydraulic fluid spraying across his cockpit canopy as control surfaces failed. At the last possible moment, Gay released his torpedo toward the carrier Kaga before his burning Devastator slammed into the ocean. He would be the only survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floating in his life jacket to witness the battle's climactic moments. The slaughter continued as Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 and Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 pressed their own attacks. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led his formation through the same wall of fire that had consumed Waldron's men, achieving nothing but their own destruction. Of 41 American torpedo bombers launched that morning, only 7 would return to their carriers. The sacrifice seemed complete and utterly pointless. But the torpedo attacks, though tactically futile, achieved something of immense strategic value. They drew the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches to Nagumo's carriers completely undefended. Every Zero fighter was either pursuing torpedo bombers or returning to base for fuel and ammunition. The sky above 30,000 feet lay empty and waiting. At exactly 10:24, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward toward Nagumo's main force. McCluskey had been searching for over an hour, his fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels that would barely get his dive bombers back to Enterprise. This single wake became his lifeline to the enemy fleet. Naval aviation records held at the Smithsonian Institution document McCluskey's crucial navigation decision as one of the most important moments in American military history. Following the destroyer's wake, McCluskey's dive bombers climbed to attack altitude just as the Japanese carriers began recovering their Midway strike force. The timing was absolutely perfect and completely accidental. Below them, Nagumo's 4 carriers presented targets that would have made a peacetime gunnery instructor weep with joy. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu steamed in formation with their flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines snaking everywhere, and ammunition stacked for rapid loading. The carriers couldn't maneuver freely while landing aircraft, and their fighter protection was either at sea level or on the deck refueling. McCluskey split his formation, leading one section against Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best took the other section toward Akagi. At 0:10:26, the first American dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives, screaming down through empty sky toward the most powerful naval force in the Pacific. 3 minutes later, the entire strategic balance of World War II would be forever altered. The sacrifice of the torpedo bomber crews was about to pay the ultimate dividend. Their deaths had cleared the path for deliverance, though none who died would live to see the victory their courage had purchased. Lieutenant Richard Best pushed his dauntless dive bomber into a 70-degree dive, the carrier Akagi growing larger in his bomb sight with each passing second. Around him, 17 other dive bombers screamed toward their targets through clear morning air, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol still struggling to climb back to altitude after massacring the torpedo squadrons. On Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo watched his returning Midway strike force landing with practiced efficiency. Flight operations proceeded smoothly despite the morning's unexpected complications, and within 30 minutes, his rearmed second wave would launch against the American fleet units. Victory still seemed within reach, requiring only the tactical adjustments that veteran commanders made routinely. The first indication of approaching doom came from a lookout's terrified shout, "Dive bombers!" Across Nagumo's flagship, heads turned skyward to see death descending at over 200 miles per hour. Battle stations' alarms shrieked throughout the ship as anti-aircraft guns swiveled desperately toward targets already too close to stop. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck Akagi's flight deck near the aft elevator at 0:10:26 hours and 17 seconds, penetrating through to the hangar deck where it detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction of secondary fires that turned Japan's premier aircraft carrier into a floating inferno within minutes. Aviation gasoline-fed flames that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, melting steel bulkheads and consuming everything combustible. Simultaneously, McCluskey's section attacked the carrier Kaga with devastating precision. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson watched his bomb disappear into the ship's forward elevator shaft before exploding deep within her vitals. 2 more direct hits followed in rapid succession, each one adding to a conflagration that would burn for hours. Kaga's flight deck buckled and twisted under the intense heat as her ammunition magazines began cooking off in spectacular explosions. The third Japanese carrier, Soryu, fell victim to Yorktown's dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie. 3 bombs struck the carrier within seconds of each other, turning her hangar deck into the same hellish furnace that was consuming her sister ships. Captain Ryusaku Yanagamoto refused evacuation orders, choosing to go down with his ship in accordance with the ancient samurai code that governed Japanese naval tradition. According to official Imperial Japanese Navy records compiled after the war and held in the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force archives, the 3 carrier strikes occurred within a span of exactly 6 minutes, the fastest decisive naval engagement in modern history. In those 6 minutes, Japan lost more naval aviation capability than in all previous Pacific engagements combined. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering from appendicitis surgery in Akagi's sick bay, felt the ship convulse under the bomb impacts and knew immediately what had happened. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood better than anyone the devastating effectiveness of dive bomber attacks against helpless carriers. As flames roared through the passageways around him, Fuchida realized that Japan's naval aviation supremacy had just been shattered by the same tactics his forces had perfected. Aboard the surviving carrier Hiryu, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi watched 3 pillars of black smoke rising from his burning compatriots and immediately began planning counterattack. His ship remained operational with a full complement of aircraft, and the Americans had revealed their position by attacking. If he could strike back quickly, some measure of tactical success might still be salvaged from this unprecedented disaster. The 3 burning carriers continued their death agonies throughout the morning, their magazines exploding at irregular intervals as damage control parties fought hopeless battles against fires fed by aviation fuel and ordnance. By noon, 2 would be abandoned to sink beneath Pacific waves that would entomb over 2,000 Japanese sailors and airmen along with their ships. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on Hiryu's bridge, his jaw set with grim determination as he watched 3 funeral pyres marking the graves of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. As the sole surviving Japanese carrier commander, he faced a decision that would define his legacy: retreat to preserve his remaining forces, or launch a desperate counterattack that might still salvage victory from catastrophe. At 11:05 hours, Yamaguchi made his choice. "Prepare for immediate launch of all available aircraft," he ordered. Hiryu's flight deck erupted into controlled chaos as 18 Aichi dive bombers and 6 Zero escorts prepared for what everyone understood would be a one-way mission. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, leading the strike, knew that finding and destroying American carriers represented their fleet's only hope for survival. The Japanese strike group found Yorktown at 14:05 hours, her distinctive island superstructure clearly visible against the afternoon sky. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's crew had performed miracles getting their battle-damaged ship operational, but now she faced the concentrated fury of Japan's most experienced dive bomber pilots seeking vengeance for their fallen carriers. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch's fighter squadron rose to meet the incoming attack, but 6 Wildcats could not stop 18 determined dive bombers. Kobayashi's formation pushed through the defensive fire, their bombs striking Yorktown's flight deck and penetrating deep into her engineering spaces. The carrier shuddered under multiple impacts as fires erupted throughout her superstructure. 2 hours later, Hiryu launched her final strike. 10 torpedo bombers under Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack against Midway. Tomonaga's aircraft had been damaged over the island, but he volunteered for this mission knowing his fuel tanks would not permit a return flight. It was the essence of Bushido, death before dishonor. Yorktown's crew fought desperately to save their ship, but Tomonaga's torpedoes found their mark. 2 massive explosions tore through the carrier's port side, flooding her engineering spaces and causing a severe list that made flight operations impossible. Captain Buckmaster reluctantly ordered abandon ship as his vessel appeared to be sinking. But Yamaguchi's Pyrrhic victory came at a terrible price. Both Japanese strike groups had been virtually annihilated by American fighters and anti-aircraft fire, leaving Hiryu with fewer than a dozen operational aircraft. The counterattacks had revealed her position to American search planes, and radar operators aboard Enterprise were already tracking incoming dive bombers bent on completing the morning's destruction. Contemporary accounts preserved in the Naval War College's historical archives describe the afternoon attacks as among the most savage air battles in Pacific War history. Japanese pilots, fighting with the fury of cornered samurai, pressed attacks through devastating defensive fire that would have broken less determined formations. Their sacrifice demonstrated the fighting spirit that had carried Japan's forces across the Pacific, but courage alone could not overcome the mathematical realities of naval aviation warfare. At 17:05 hours, Enterprise's dive bombers found Hiryu steaming desperately toward the northwest, her deck crowded with the few aircraft remaining to Japan's once mighty carrier striking force. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led 24 dauntless dive bombers into their final attack of the day, their crews exhausted from hours of combat, but grimly determined to complete the destruction of Japanese naval aviation. 4 direct hits turned Hiryu into the same raging inferno that had consumed her sister ships. Admiral Yamaguchi, following the samurai tradition of accepting responsibility for failure, chose to go down with his flagship rather than face the shame of returning to Japan with news of this unprecedented defeat. His last radio message to Admiral Yamamoto was simple and devastating. "Hiryu severely damaged. We are preparing to abandon ship." By sunset on June 4, 1942, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the cream of the Imperial Navy's striking force, lay on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean along with over 300 aircraft and their irreplaceable pilots. The 6-month string of Japanese victories had ended in a single day's catastrophic defeat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the devastating reports from his flagship Yamato, stationed 300 miles behind the action with the main battle fleet. The architect of Pearl Harbor absorbed each message with stoic composure, though those who knew him recognized the telltale signs of inner anguish in his weathered features. By 1800 hours on June 4th, the mathematical foundation of his entire Pacific strategy had crumbled into statistical impossibility. The numbers told a story more catastrophic than any single battle in Japanese naval history. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, over 300 aircraft lost, and nearly 2,500 naval personnel dead or missing, including many of the veteran pilots who had formed the backbone of Japanese naval aviation since the China War. Captain Minoru Genda, Yamamoto's chief air staff officer, calculated that Japan had lost more carrier aviation capability in one day than America could produce in 6 months. But the true strategic disaster lay not in the immediate losses, but in their irreplaceable nature. The dead pilots represented years of intensive training that Japan's compressed wartime schedule could never replicate. Flight Petty Officer Kyoto Furuta, who had survived the Pearl Harbor attack and dozens of subsequent operations, now rested on the Pacific floor along with the skills and experience that had made Japanese naval aviation supreme. Training replacement pilots of comparable ability would require 2 years that Japan no longer possessed. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, evacuated from the burning Akagi with severe burns, would later write that Midway represented the moment when Japan's offensive capabilities died. His post-war memoir, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, published by the Naval Institute Press, provides perhaps the most authoritative Japanese perspective on the engagement's strategic implications. The tactical brilliance that had characterized Japanese operations since Pearl Harbor had been shattered by superior American intelligence and the mathematical superiority of industrial production. Admiral Chester Nimitz, monitoring the battle's progress from his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood that June 4th marked more than just a tactical victory. American industrial capacity was already producing carriers and aircraft at rates that dwarfed Japanese capabilities. The Essex-class carriers beginning construction would field air groups larger than entire Japanese carrier divisions, while pilot training programs were graduating crews by the thousands rather than hundreds. The strategic mathematics were brutally simple. Japan had entered the war with approximately 450 experienced carrier pilots distributed among 6 fleet carriers. By sunset on June 4th, more than half those pilots were dead, and 2/3 of the carriers were sinking. America, conversely, was graduating over 1,500 new naval aviators monthly from training programs that were still expanding. The arithmetic of attrition now favored the United States by margins that made Japanese defeat inevitable. Yamamoto faced the most difficult decision of his strategic career. His main battle fleet remained intact with 9 battleships and supporting cruisers, theoretically capable of continuing toward Midway for a surface engagement. But without air cover, his ships would be defenseless against American land-based bombers and the surviving carrier aircraft. The invasion of Midway had become tactically impossible without the air superiority that his lost carriers were supposed to provide. At 02:55 on June 5th, Yamamoto transmitted the order that acknowledged Japan's first major defeat. The Midway operation is canceled. All forces will withdraw immediately. The message rippled through the combined fleet with the finality of a funeral dirge. Officers who had never known defeat struggled to comprehend that their invincible navy had been shattered in a single morning's engagement. The withdrawal began under cover of darkness, Japanese ships turning west toward their home islands, while behind them the Pacific burned with the funeral pyres of 4 aircraft carriers. Captain Watanabe Yasuji, observing the retreat from the heavy cruiser Tone, wrote in his diary that night, "The tide of war has turned. We who flew so high have fallen into an abyss from which there may be no return." His prophetic words would prove more accurate than anyone could have imagined in those dark hours of defeat. The morning of June 5th, 1942, dawned over a transformed Pacific Ocean. Where 24 hours earlier the Imperial Japanese Navy had ruled supreme with seemingly unstoppable momentum, now oil slicks and debris marked the graves of 4 aircraft carriers and Japan's dream of Pacific dominance. The Battle of Midway had ended not with the gradual shift of strategic advantage that military historians typically chronicle, but with the sudden, catastrophic reversal that occurs perhaps once in a generation of warfare. Admiral Nimitz released his preliminary battle report to Pearl Harbor at 0800 hours, the stark statistics reading like a mathematical proof of American victory. Japanese losses: 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 personnel. American losses: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel. The exchange rate was so favorable that Washington initially questioned whether the numbers could be accurate. Captain Joseph Rochefort and his code-breaking team had achieved something unprecedented in military intelligence history. They had provided their commanders with perfect strategic information that enabled an outnumbered force to achieve complete tactical surprise against a superior enemy. The National Security Agency's declassified histories, released in 1999, confirm that the Midway victory established signals intelligence as the decisive factor in modern warfare. Never again would major military operations be planned without considering the enemy's ability to intercept and decode communications. The Japanese survivors struggled homeward aboard damaged ships, their wounded crying out in sick bays while repair crews worked desperately to keep vessels afloat. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, architect of Pearl Harbor's success, lay in a hospital bunk reflecting on the ironic reversal of fortune. The same dive-bombing tactics his forces had perfected against battleships at Pearl Harbor had been turned against Japanese carriers with devastating effectiveness. The student had become the master in the span of 6 months. On Midway itself, the defenders emerged from their bunkers to survey a landscape cratered by Japanese bombs but still firmly under American control. Major Floyd Parks and his Marines had held their tiny coral fortress against the cream of Japanese naval aviation, proving that properly prepared defenses could withstand even the most determined attacks. The strategic value of Midway as an early warning station and bomber base would prove incalculable in the campaigns to follow. But the battle's true significance lay not in the immediate tactical results, but in its psychological impact on both sides. Japanese naval officers who had never known defeat now faced the crushing realization that their forces were not invincible. The myth of Japanese tactical superiority, carefully cultivated since the Russo-Japanese War, had been shattered by American pilots flying obsolete aircraft with desperate courage. Morale throughout the combined fleet would never fully recover from this psychological blow. Conversely, American forces discovered that Japanese naval aviation could be defeated by superior intelligence, better tactics, and the kind of sacrificial courage displayed by torpedo bomber crews. The victory at Midway proved that American industrial capacity, when properly directed, could overcome any tactical disadvantage through sheer mathematical superiority. Aircraft plants across America increased production schedules, while pilot training programs expanded to meet demands that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Admiral Yamamoto returned to Japan, bearing news that would reshape the empire's entire strategic outlook. The quick victory that was supposed to force American negotiation had instead triggered a grinding war of attrition that Japan could not possibly win. Imperial General Headquarters began planning defensive operations for the first time since 1941, acknowledging that the initiative in the Pacific War had permanently passed to the United States. The Battle of Midway ended at sunset on June 6th, when the last Japanese stragglers disappeared over the western horizon. Behind them, they left more than ships and aircraft. They left Japan's dream of Pacific Empire sinking beneath the waves along with the carriers that were supposed to make that dream reality. The tide had turned with mathematical finality, and it would never turn back. America's island-hopping campaign toward Japan had begun with this single day's decisive victory, though the final reckoning still lay 3 years and countless battles in the future.